Much has been said about the Beethoven Frieze. It is one of Klimt's works whose meaning is well documented and well understood. There are oft-quoted lines that guide the interpretation of the Frieze, which I believe originate with Richard Wagner's interpretation of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, thus giving the Frieze its name. Apparently, these lines, or parts of them, were quoted or paraphrased by Klimt himself as titles for the various sections of the Frieze, listed in the Secession's 14th exhibition catalog. It opens with Yearning for Happiness, a highly original composition depicting disembodied genii, the spirits of humanity, who float from left to right along the very top of the picture plane, leaving most of it empty. This radical use of negative space was virtually unique to Klimt in all the Western world. Whistler's Mother of 1871 gives somewhat of an antecedent, but not really, not like this. And, like Whistler, Klimt doubtlessly got this radical use of negative space from his exposure, such as it was, to Japanese art. Yet he seems enthralled with the prospect of pushing this exotic emphasis on negative space as far as aesthetically possible, almost to the breaking point. And, like a true master, he goes right up to the edge, then nimbly avoids going over it. The figures of the genii are decorative insofar as that they are contrived as a repeating pattern. Yet decorative, at this point in history, has yet to take on any of the negative connotations that it now has. As indeed we are in the midst of Art Nouveau in this period. The decorative is sought and celebrated by the zeitgeist. To contrive has yet to become contrived. The alternating emptiness and ethereal genii transport us immediately to the realm of the interior, the spiritual. Then we come to the sufferings of weak mankind and the petition of weak mankind to the well-armed strong one to take up the struggle for happiness, impelled by motives of compassion and ambition. This is personified by a knight in golden armor above whom ambition, an Athena-like goddess, holds the promise of the laurel wreath, achievement, whilst compassion holds a fawning pose. I recall the way I first responded to this scene 13 years prior to seeing it finally in person. I came across it for the first time in the pages of a book on Klimt at a Barnes & Noble's in Oceanside, California. It was the year 2000 and Barnes & Noble's had recently bought out Bookstar, the place I had gone to for books whilst I was a teen in the 90s. I had recently made a pivot from music to visual art, and I was in the art section looking for inspiration. A large golden book jumped out at me, Klimt, Life and Work, by Susanna Parched. It was $20, which in those days was half a day's wages, at least for a minimum wage worker like me, but no matter. As I flipped through the pages, I knew immediately that I would buy it. Klimt's work spoke to me like no other artist I had ever seen. This book, I believe, was the spearhead of a new effort to popularize Klimt's work with a public that had, at that time, little familiarity with it. Over the next decades, his popularity would explode, at least with ordinary people, never with art critics or the highbrow art world. Well, until they were forced to take notice by Klimt's rise not only with the tasteless plebes, but also with the high rollers in the art market. Don Thompson, author of The $12 Million Stuffed Shark, The Curious Economics of Contemporary Art, describes the moment when Klimt could no longer be ignored by the tastemakers of the highbrow art world. In 2006, Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer sold at auction for $135 million. According to Thompson, until this sale, most art historians and critics would have ranked Klimt as a second-tier modern painter, and that is what his previous auction records suggest. The price illustrates the ease at which art history is now rewritten with a checkbook. I've never been able to decide whether Thompson agrees with the previous consensus or the one established by the buyer. I rather think he is inclined to scoff along with the condescending views towards Klimt that had predominated the higher tiers of the art world prior to this. But there is a world of difference between a brave connoisseur willing to shell out millions for an artwork he believes in, and that is not currently held in high esteem, compared with the vapid buyers of shallow trends who trade on branding alone. Anyway, let's go back to the year 2000. It was there, sitting on the floor of that bookstore, flipping through this book, that I first encountered a photo of the Beethoven Frieze. Its symbolic value struck me immediately. The whole fairy tale was laid out there. The inner journey from a state of lies and falsehood to one of truth and authenticity. The promise of the rescued princess. The fruits of love that would result. The seemingly insurmountable barriers in the way. From the book by Parch, Klimt described the group as the petition from weak mankind to the strong one in armor as external force, to pity and driving energy, the female figures, as inner force, which can move him to champion the fight for happiness. His posture, the posture of the knight, does not suggest a refusal to answer weak humanity's petition. Rather, his gaze, directed towards the narrow wall, shows him already contemplating the struggle. Ah, the knight. It meant so much to me as a child. I can hear again Bimbi's mocking voice, Il cavaliere che salva tutti. And though it stings, I can understand his cynicism. Still, from my youngest memories, I was fascinated by knights in shining armor, and I wished the modern world had not obliterated their existence and utility so that I might have grown up to be one myself. Mechanized war, the randomness of stray bullets and artillery strikes, the ugly green camo of the modern military, it all felt repulsive to me. But the bright gleaming sword, from the eye to the heart to the hand, an action like drawing. Man strikes out with his steel, and it is an extension of his will, his soul. And what does armor mean? It also seems symbolic. Such deep resonance with the soul and the psychological dimension of man's being. Khan Academy put out a video on the Beethoven Frieze. I found it hilarious that they couldn't discuss the knight without adding a warning that strong men are dangerous. They discuss the scene briefly, then out of the blue they suddenly feel compelled to append a lame caveat that argues something to the effect of, well, yes, it might be fun to imagine this noble knight, but remember, looking to a strong man to solve your problems is inevitably going to give rise to someone like Hitler. If this critique can be boiled down to the liberal fearing the conservative, Klimt, of course, gives us plenty of opportunities for pearl clutching that run in the opposite direction. And of course, this is primarily in the realm of sexuality. I find it fascinating that even into this very conventional schema, an essentialized archetype of the medieval fairy tale, Klimt slips in a thinly veiled allusion to a man with two lovers. True enough, these women who hover above the knight who inspire him, they are designed to be perceived as abstract entities, allegories. No one can make an outright allegation that Klimt is proposing any kind of polygamous or polyamorous arrangement here. but the implication remains, and Klimt, of course, was famous for his own scandalous number of simultaneously maintained mistresses. It recalls to me the infamous painting by Theodore Géricault, A Man with Two Loves, or Three Lovers, as I see it more often labeled these days. Painted much earlier, near 1820, it was a precursor to this libertine spirit. Far more scandalous because it was explicit, whereas Klimt's, at least here, is only implicit. Of course, this libertine spirit is easily traced back even earlier, especially to the French attitudes in the era of Rococo. 200 years later, that is to say now, Géricault's A Man with Two Loves hardly raises an eyebrow. Klimt's subtle allusion in the Beethoven Frieze doesn't even register with most, but to me, when I saw it for the first time, I was deeply moved. True, the knight is seen embracing only one woman at the end. Is it perhaps the poor, impoverished creature who stands behind the couple on their knees, reaching out to implore the knight? A pathetic figure who is herself lifted to grandeur upon the knight's successful completion of his quest. The woman may be that poor, emaciated creature, the daughter of those two who are on their knees imploring the knight. But now, here at the end, she has been lifted by grace to embody both goddesses, ambition and compassion, in the embrace of her victorious hero. I like this interpretation because it suggests that she was always accessible from the start. Likewise, what we desire in the inner quest, truth, reality, authenticity, lies within us already from the very start of that inner journey. And yet the journey must be made. The quest must be undertaken. What would the knight be if, after gazing upon the horrors that await him, he simply decides to turn around and embrace the woman and cling and cleave to her in this state of utter abject poverty? But then, if we choose to embrace the quest, we must muster our courage to face that section of the phrase that Klimt portrays as a dark knot, a clog, a blockage, obstacle of seemingly insurmountable scale placed between the knight and his promised destiny. Klimt, channeling Wagner, describes it as the hostile forces, Typhon the giant, against whom even gods fought in vain, his daughters, the three Gorgons, who symbolize lust and lechery, intemperance and gnawing care. And referring to the floating genii again, the longings and wishes of mankind to fly over their heads. Now I realized why I felt sad and jaded as I walked up to the real fresco on that day. Why, as I write this, I keep wanting to return to that moment over a decade earlier when I knelt on the floor of the bookstore, holding Partch's book on my lap, wrapped in elation and reverie upon seeing this vision of man's deepest longings, the spiritual quest I believed in with all my heart, made manifest before my eyes. That was the moment when I still believed it was possible to achieve this quest. But now, as I walked up on the iron scaffolding to view the actual paintings, I could only smile sadly. Smile at myself mostly, at my innocence and naivete, my dashed hopes for that greatest dream. It's a long story and I won't get into it here, but my own knight did not fare too well against Typhon when he encountered him. But what if Klimt never meant to suggest that it is this knight's destiny to emerge victorious from his encounter with Typhon? In fact, this seems more plausible to me. The knot of confusion and chaos and death posed by the mass of Typhon and his daughters seems insurmountable. And then we have Klimt's own words paraphrasing Wagner, Typhon the giant, against whom even gods fought in vain. If gods could not vanquish this monstrosity, how can our knight, who is, after all, a mere mortal? And what does Klimt suggest? The longings and wishes of mankind to fly over their heads. Thus we see the genii emerge from behind the scene, and the suggestion is that they have indeed floated above this storm to emerge on the other side. Perhaps it is the suggestion that Typhon and his daughters are unconquerable. The knight may win some battles, lose others. It certainly matters a great deal to the knight if he wins or loses, and it matters to those on whose behalf he fights. Yet, in the grander scheme of things, the great knot of confusion and evil will remain woven into the fabric of this worldly existence. Our best hope is to pass through the storm and keep yearning for that which draws us. And then, a curious thing happens. The repeating pattern of the genii terminates at the golden lyre or kithara of a sapphic poetess, reminiscent of the Greek vase painting that Klimt loved so much. The yearning for happiness is assuaged in poetry. The arts lead us to the ideal realm in which we can all find pure joy, pure happiness, pure love. In the end, we are saved not by the heroic efforts of the knight, but by art itself. The promise of salvation was illusory. There is no salvation in this life, but we can temporarily forget our sufferings when we allow ourselves to be transported to the heavenly realms that art can open us up to. There is a blank space on the wall here, under which would have been placed the statue of Beethoven by Max Klinger. Now, we understand that within the phrase, the sapphic poetess is a stand-in for Beethoven, and the knight is too. The knight is a stand-in for the artist who goes on to create in spite of the demons that can rise within. But what else can we intuit from this blank space? I think it is more symbolic than a mere deference to Klinger's sculpture. Certainly that was part of it. The phrase was conceived as a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, meant to function in contextual harmony with the building and the sculpture. But beyond this, the significance of the empty space becomes apparent when we consider what follows, the final scene. Klimt described it as choir of angels from paradise, joy, lovely spark of heaven's fire, this embrace for all the world. This last bit cites Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, the poem which inspired the last theme of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The knight is naked now, his armor removed, no longer needed. We see only his muscular back as he passionately embraces a woman whose arms are thrown lovingly around his neck. We can imagine that the two are sharing a deep, passionate kiss, though we cannot see it. From their feet and ankles, a magic sort of thread-like material is wrapping up from the ankles to the calves, a symbolic suggestion of their process of uniting together, melting into one another. The core symbol beneath the hollowed act of sexual union when approached on a higher level of being. This is no mere fornication, it is a holy union, a sacred mystery rite, eternally ineffable and vital. But where does it take place? Not in the real world. It takes place in the heart. A door to the inmost chamber of the heart is opened here. Klimt depicts it quite clearly, albeit symbolically. If we dissect the form of the shapes that surround the embracing figures, we see a rose bush, parted in the middle and flanked by golden streaming lines. There is a simultaneous upward motion and the sense that the gap in the rosebush acts as a portal, opening to the pure golden background behind them, an indication of the highest heaven, the pure bliss that they are about to melt into. The rosebush, by the way, is inspired by Charles René Mackintosh. and the jewels that are placed into the plaster are inspired by his wife, Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh, who made similar gesso panels with inlaid jewels and gems. A sort of golden halo crowns the figure with undulating lines that continues the overall sense of upward motion and strong pulsating energy. Two round faces, highly stylized and reminiscent of personified planets or moons or abstract principles, converge upon the halo, seeming to represent the masculine and feminine principle. It feels as if we are witnessing an inner Neoplatonic version of something akin to nuclear fusion. And it certainly is Neoplatonic. Of that there can be no doubt. It is, in fact, the essential core of the Neoplatonic vision, especially that particular strain of Neoplatonism that inspired the artists of the Renaissance. Perfection is touched only in the inner dimension. The outward forms can approach it, but never fully realize the perfect forms that reside only in the ideal realm. Here we come back to that gap, the blank space on the wall. We saw that the genii terminate in a golden space of pleasure that seems to emanate from the golden kithara of the Sapphic poetess. After her, the open, empty space. Then these genii emerge again, but now, rather than going in a horizontal direction along the top of the picture plane, we see them emerging from the bottom of the picture plane, going vertically up and running parallel alongside the climactic scene of the embrace. They reinforce the overall upward motion of the scene. I have not spoken of the choir of angels that surrounds the couple in their heavenly embrace. This, of course, is meant as a visual embodiment of Beethoven's climactic theme, Ode to Joy, which in turn is harnessed to emphasize the metaphysical process Klimt is depicting here. What I find fascinating is how the genii moving upward begin to reach out their hands towards the singers of the choir. But there is an unbridgeable gap of negative space between the heavenly realm inhabited by these angelic singers and the space in which those genii exist. Their hands reach out as if drawn like flowers to the sun, the unconscious motion of nature unfolding her design. The genii have their eyes closed, listening. The singers also have their eyes closed, tuned into the spirit that animates their song. The hands of the genii come extremely close to those of the singers, yet never actually touch. The genii are the key to understanding this artwork. The genii are individuals, you and I, as we float through our ordinary lives. The odds are we will not engage with the titanic struggles intimated by the drama in the scenes. Some will, of course, but most people don't. We may have our own peaks of drama, but these may pale in comparison with the kinds of struggles involved in true heroism. Heroism itself is a concept we have tarnished beyond repair with our culture of participation trophies, but that's another subject. Still, we can participate in the grand feelings stirred up by those great deeds by way of the arts. The passive genii receive the emotion and thrills without ever being in actual harm's way. They float above the scenes because they are the audience. The audience is never in danger from the play's antagonists. They are, in fact, us as we walk through the Secession building, gazing on the knight and Typhon and his daughters. Of course we cannot touch the choir. Of course we cannot touch the pair who embrace at the center of the climax. But we can be moved by their stories, moved by the music of their hearts, touched within our own hearts by their great joy. Now we see the knight is Beethoven, but even more so, the knight is Klimt. I've heard it said that the knight may have been modeled on Gustav Mahler, who conducted the performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony at the opening of the exhibition. Yet even if this is true, the knight is certainly also Klimt. How can I say that? The knight is the archetypal man of action. And artists, are they ever men of action? Occasionally. Often we are not. But the best of them will have some red blood in their veins, enough to have borne them close to some great adventures in life. Only those who have the courage that impels towards adventure can touch the place where the true muses reside. You must understand that Klimt is at once the knight as well as one of the nameless observers, those floating genii. Unlike Nietzsche, Klimt does not hate the suffering, meek mankind for their weakness. He knows himself to be one of them. Unlike Nietzsche, he does not pretend to be a Superman. Yes, he has had some intimation of what is required to be a Superman. So, like Beethoven, he undertakes the action needed to bring a great vision into being. And with his bold actions, he shares the bounty of the ideal realm with the suffering mankind that he loves. Thanks for watching. This has been me reading an excerpt from my upcoming book, Bellezza e Sporcizia, Beauty and Filth. It's a mix of journal entries and memoirs with reflections on art and culture. I'm not sure when it will be done, but if you are interested in my writing, you can get my book Thoughts, which was published recently on Amazon. To find it, just make sure you have books selected from the drop-down menu when you enter these keywords. Brian D.K. Thoughts. Thoughts is a collection of poetry and prose on a wide range of topics and includes over 150 original drawings that I made over the course of 10 years. And as always, if you want to support my channel, please just like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton as I'm trying to grow this channel, and I really appreciate it if you do. Thanks so much, and ciao for now.